0.83 children per woman. That's Singapore's total fertility rate, among the lowest in the world. To maintain population stability, a society needs approximately 2.1 children per woman. Singapore isn't even half that. At current rates, each generation is 40% smaller than the one before. In demographic terms, this is catastrophic. In human terms, it's the predictable outcome of building a society that makes family formation economically irrational. This isn't about cultural preference or changing values. It's about what happens when you optimize a society so completely for productivity that reproduction becomes a luxury most people cannot afford. When the system designed to create prosperity makes the biological continuation of that society impractical. When every incentive points away from having children, while every policy speech claims to support families. But before we start, if you're interested in understanding how economic systems shape demographic futures, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. Singapore's demographic crisis didn't emerge overnight. The government identified falling birth rates as a concern in the 1980s and has been trying to reverse the trend for 4 decades. They've implemented every policy intervention demographic experts recommend. Cash incentives for babies, extended parental leave, priority housing for families with children, subsidized childcare, tax rebates, public messaging campaigns. Nothing works. The fertility rate keeps falling despite increasingly generous programs. This persistence suggests the problem isn't insufficient incentives, but structural incompatibility between how Singapore functions and the requirements of raising children. The economic calculation young Singaporeans make is brutally simple. Housing costs 5 to 7 times annual income. A second child means upgrading from a 3-room to a 4-room flat, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars to housing burden. Education costs consume substantial portions of middle-class income. Between tuition, enrichment, childcare, career interruptions for parenting, even brief ones, create permanent earning gaps in a system that rewards continuous advancement. Children transform from economic assets as they are in agricultural societies, or emotionally valuable additions as they are in wealthy societies with strong social support, into financial liabilities that strain family resources over decades. The housing fertility connection deserves particular attention. The HDB allocation system prioritizes families with children, providing larger flats and better locations. This sounds supportive until you examine the mechanics. You must get married and apply for housing, then wait 3 to 4 years for construction completion, then move in and establish the household. Only then does having children become practical. By the time couples navigate this timeline, women are often approaching or past peak fertility years. The system creates delays that biology doesn't accommodate. Late marriage plus slow housing allocation plus financial pressure to establish careers before disrupting them equals fertility delay that becomes fertility decline. The childcare infrastructure reveals similar patterns. The government subsidizes childcare extensively, making Singapore among the most affordable childcare markets globally in absolute terms. But affordable relative to what? Center-based infant care still costs $800 to $1,200 monthly, even after subsidies. For 2 children, that's comparable to housing costs, and childcare centers operate defined hours. Parents with demanding jobs, which describes most professionals in Singapore, need supplementary care. Domestic helpers, grandparents, or reducing work hours. Each option carries costs financial or professional. The system provides support, but support calibrated to enable continued workforce participation, not to make child-rearing comfortable or financially sustainable. The opportunity cost calculation hits women particularly hard. Singapore's gender pay gap isn't unusually large by global standards, but the structure of career progression makes interruptions costly. Professional advancement happens in your late 20s and early 30s, precisely when fertility is highest. Taking maternity leave, reducing hours, or stepping back for childcare creates gaps that competitors don't have. In a system as competitive as Singapore's, gaps matter. Women watch peers pull ahead while they manage childcare logistics. The rational choice becomes delaying childbearing until careers are established, by which time biological windows narrow, and completing families becomes rushed or impossible. The parental leave policies, generous by regional standards, reveal this tension. Mothers receive 16 weeks paid maternity leave, fathers receive 2 weeks. On paper, this seems supportive. In practice, 16 weeks is insufficient for establishing childcare arrangements, recovering from childbirth complications, or bonding with infants in ways child development research suggests matters. and that's for the first child. For subsequent children, many women find employers less accommodating, colleagues less understanding, career trajectories more damaged. The policy supports having one child, maybe two, but one or two children per family doesn't solve demographic decline. The social expectations around parenting intensified precisely as economic conditions made meeting those expectations harder. Good parents in contemporary Singapore enroll children in enrichment from toddlerhood: piano, swimming, Mandarin enrichment, coding classes. Good parents ensure children attend quality childcare centers and preschools with wait lists requiring registration at birth. Good parents live in neighborhoods with good primary schools, which means expensive housing. Good parents can afford domestic help or have grandparent support for childcare gaps. The standard of adequate parenting has escalated to levels that require either substantial wealth or family support most young couples lack. The grandparent generation, traditionally a childcare resource, faces its own constraints. Many are still working into their 60s because CPF minimum sums keep rising and retirement adequacy concerns persist. Those who are retired often have their own lives, travel, activities, commitments. The assumption that grandparents will provide free childcare increasingly doesn't hold, especially for two-child or three-child families where the care burden becomes substantial. Even willing grandparents cannot bridge the gap between working parent schedules and childcare center hours when both parents work the typical Singaporean professional schedule. The government's public messaging creates additional pressure through well-intentioned campaigns that backfire. Exhortations to have children, public service announcements about demographic challenges, ministerial speeches warning about aging populations, all this communicates urgency without addressing structural barriers. Young couples don't need convincing that children are valuable. They need housing they can afford without taking 40 years to repay mortgages. They need career structures that don't punish parenting. They need childcare systems that work for actual working hours, not idealized 8-to-5 jobs nobody has. The messaging treats low fertility as a preference problem when it's a constraint problem. The comparison to other low fertility societies is instructive. South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan share similar demographic patterns, but they also share similar structural features. Expensive housing, intensive parenting cultures, limited work-life balance, gender traditional divisions of domestic labor despite workplace gender equity rhetoric, weak parental support systems. The common factor isn't cultural but economic. Hyper-competitive capitalist economies with high costs of living and intensive child-rearing expectations produce low fertility regardless of culture. Singapore's efforts to reverse this through incentives alone ignore that the entire economic model creates pressures that cash bonuses cannot offset. The immigration solution Singapore has increasingly relied on treats symptoms, not causes. Importing workers addresses labor shortages but doesn't solve the existential question of who Singaporeans will be in 2 generations. If each generation of citizens shrinks by 40% while immigrant populations grow, at what point does the national identity the government so carefully cultivates become demographically irrelevant? The ethnic ratio management that shapes housing and education policy assumes a reproducing citizen population. If citizens don't reproduce, those policies lose their foundations. The long-term fiscal implications are severe. Singapore's social security system, limited as it is, depends on ratios between working-age populations and retirees. As fertility falls and longevity increases, those ratios deteriorate rapidly. Fewer workers must support more retirees through taxes, healthcare costs, and eventually expanded social services aging populations require. The government's fiscal conservatism has created substantial reserves, but reserves get depleted if demographic trends continue. No amount of past savings prevents future insolvency when the working population shrinks continuously. The elder care crisis follows inevitably from demographic decline. An aging society needs caregivers, but caregiving work pays poorly and carries low status. Singaporeans increasingly won't do it, requiring imported care workers. But imported care workers need supervision, create cultural gaps, and represent their own dependencies and vulnerabilities. The model of importing labor to care for aging citizens cannot scale indefinitely, especially as sending countries develop and their own populations age. The psychological dimensions deserve acknowledgement. Living in a society with falling fertility creates ambient anxiety about the future. Shopping malls and parks feel less populated. Schools consolidate or close. Neighborhoods designed for young families increasingly house elderly residents. The vibrancy that comes from children and young families diminishes. This isn't abstract concern about statistics. It's the felt experience of living in a society that's demographically contracting, and that experience feeds back into fertility decisions. Who wants to raise children in a society that feels like it's declining? The dating and marriage patterns upstream of fertility show their own dysfunction. Marriage rates have fallen alongside fertility. The median age of first marriage has risen to over 30 for men, late 20s for women. But delayed marriage isn't about choice so much as circumstance. The financial requirements for marriage, particularly housing, push timelines later. The career demands of establishing oneself before starting a family create delays. The competition inherent in Singapore's social structure makes partner selection fraught with concerns about educational matching, economic compatibility, family background. By the time couples marry, they're often already facing biological clocks that constrain family size even if they want multiple children. The government's attempts to facilitate dating through state-sponsored matching services highlight the desperation tinged with absurdity. The Social Development Unit, later rebranded as Social Development Network, exists to help educated Singaporeans meet and pair off. That such an organization exists at all reveals the dysfunction. In healthy societies, people meet organically through school, work, hobbies, social circles. In Singapore, work hours eliminate social time, residential patterns prevent organic community formation, and the intensity of competition makes social interactions transactional. Government intervention in dating markets treats symptoms of social atomization without addressing causes. The class dimensions of fertility decline matter significantly. Wealthier, more educated Singaporeans have fewer children than poorer, less educated Singaporeans, though fertility is low across all groups. This creates perverse dynamics where the government wants certain people to reproduce more than others, though this cannot be stated explicitly. Policies that target educated women through workplace benefits or that focus on marriage among graduates reveal these priorities. But fertility is fundamentally biological and social, not something that responds well to eugenic-adjacent policy preferences. The comparison to pro-natalist policies elsewhere provides limited optimism. France achieved modest fertility increases through extensive support, but from higher baselines and with far more generous policies than Singapore implements. Scandinavian countries maintain relatively high fertility through comprehensive social support systems and labor market structures fundamentally different from Singapore's. The examples of successful pro-natalist policy all involve either much higher baseline fertility or much more extensive restructuring of work, housing, and social support than Singapore has attempted. Incremental incentives don't overcome structural barriers. The environmental dimension occasionally surfaces in discussions, though usually obliquely. In a warming world with resource constraints, is population decline actually a problem? Economically, it creates challenges, but environmentally, it might be advantageous. Singapore's carbon footprint per capita is high. Fewer Singaporeans means lower emissions, less consumption, reduced environmental impact. This logic appears occasionally in discourse, though governments cannot embrace it without abandoning the entire premise that demographic decline is a crisis requiring intervention. The generational contract phrase under demographic stress, older Singaporeans expected their children and their children's children to be more prosperous, to care for them in old age, to continue the national project. Younger Singaporeans increasingly cannot fulfill these expectations even if they want to. They cannot have large families, cannot afford housing that accommodates extended family, cannot reduce work to provide elder care. The implicit bargain that sacrifice enables future prosperity breaks when the future population doesn't exist to enjoy that prosperity. The technology solutions sometimes proposed, automation to replace missing workers, AI to provide elder care, treat human beings as economic units rather than members of society. A country with robots instead of children isn't solving demographic decline, it's automating society's end. The emotional, cultural, and social roles children and families play cannot be automated. A future Singapore with shrinking native population, imported workforce, and automated services might function economically, but it would be unrecognizable as a continuation of what Singapore claims to be. The policy options remaining mostly involve admitting that the current model is incompatible with reproduction, dramatically reduce housing costs through massive public construction or land reclamation, restructure work expectations to enable parenting without career sacrifice. Provide universal basic income, allowing one parent to stay home if desired. Guarantee childcare from infancy through primary school at minimal cost. Make education less competitive so enrichment pressures diminish. Each of these requires abandoning cherished policies or confronting politically difficult trade-offs. It's easier to run another campaign encouraging marriage than to restructure the housing market. The psychological experience of living through demographic decline deserves attention. It's not dramatic or sudden, it's gradual emptying. Fewer children in playgrounds, longer periods between seeing pregnant women, primary schools converting to other uses, the average age of crowds increasing. These changes happen slowly enough that they feel normal until you stop and calculate that at current rates, Singapore's citizen population could halve within a century. That's not a future problem, it's a transformation happening now, experienced daily by anyone paying attention. Singapore optimized itself for economic competition so thoroughly that it made biological reproduction economically irrational for most citizens. The incentives all point toward maximizing individual productivity and consumption. Children reduce both. They consume resources, reduce working hours, create unpredictability incompatible with optimization. The system that created prosperity did so by structuring life in ways fundamentally incompatible with raising families. And now the bill comes due. The 0.83 fertility rate isn't a mystery requiring explanation. It's the predictable outcome of every policy choice Singapore made. Expensive housing, intensive education, competitive labor markets, limited social support, cultural emphasis on achievement, these all make perfect sense individually. Collectively, they make family formation a luxury. The government wants higher fertility while maintaining all the conditions that suppress it. This is wanting the outcome without accepting the requirements. Demographic collapse happens slowly, then suddenly. For now, Singapore appears functional, immigration masks citizen population decline, reserves fund growing elder care costs, work continues, commerce flows, life goes on, but the trajectory is clear, each generation smaller than the last. Each year, fewer babies born. Each decade, the population becomes older, more dependent, less able to sustain the productivity that funds everything. The demographic time bomb isn't hypothetical, it's ticking, and Singapore has run out of easy solutions.